They knew the country would need a firewall to keep partisan flames from scorching our republic. So they created the Senate. Out of necessity, James Madison wrote, of some stable institution in the government. Of some stable institution in the government. Today, we will fulfill this founding purpose. We will reject this incoherent case that comes nowhere near justifying the first presidential removal in history. This partisan impeachment will end today. But I fear the threat to our institutions may not, because this episode is one of a symptom of something much deeper. In the last 3 years, the opposition to this president has come to revolve around a truly dangerous concept.
If you are just joining us, we could be anywhere from 5 to 15, maybe 20 minutes away from the Senate vote on impeachment. We learned that Republican Mitt Romney would vote to convict Donald Trump on one of the two counts, but not the other. Charles Schumer has already spoken. Mitch McConnell now speaking. What is invariably going to be the acquittal of President Trump. Welcome. We are here. We are seeing corruption in the flesh, as I see people saying in the chat. Welcome on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook Live. We're here. I will take your questions as we listen to Mitch McConnell. It is a very, very sad day.
An election, it accepts defeat. It reflects and retools. But not this time. Within months, Secretary Clinton was suggesting her defeat was invalid. She called our president illegitimate. Former president falsely claimed that President Trump didn't actually win. He lost the election, the former president said. And members of Congress have used similar rhetoric. A disinformation campaign, weakening confidence in our democracy. The very real issue of foreign election interference was abused to fuel conspiracy theories. For years, prominent voices said there'd been a secret conspiracy between the president's campaign and a foreign government. But when the Mueller investigation and the Senate Intelligence Committee debunked that, the delegitimizing endeavor didn't stop.
Waffles Giraffle says via Super Chat, in the future, any president can do what he wants. Everyone knows this only applies to Republicans, as Democrats are held to a higher standard by their voters. Very well said.
Trump, in November, that election will be presumptively invalid as well. That's chairmanship on this floor.
The funny thing about this is if Trump loses in November, he's going to say the election was rigged, invalid, and it's going to cause a shitstorm.
As well. So they still don't accept the American voters' last decision. And now they're preparing to...
Jackie Tupper says via Super Chat, donate to their competition. Yes, that's effectively what you're doing, Jackie. Thank you.
Not only the last decision, but the next decision. Heads, we win. Tails, you cheated. And who can trust our democracy anyway, they say. This kind of talk creates more fear and division than our foreign adversaries could achieve in their wildest dreams. As Dr. Hill testified, our adversaries...
He would know. He's been blocking investigations into foreign interference.
...against each other, degrade our institutions, and destroy the faith of the American people in our democracy. And as she noted, if Americans become consumed by partisan rancor, we can easily do that work for them. The architects of this impeachment claimed they were defending norms and traditions. In reality, it was an assault on both. First, the House attacked its own precedents on fairness and due process, and by rushing to use the impeachment power as a political weapon of first resort. Then their articles attacked the office of the presidency. Then they attacked the Senate and called us treacherous. Then the far left tried to impugn the Chief Justice for remaining neutral during the trial. And now, for the final act, the Speaker of the House is trying to steal the Senate's sole power to render a verdict. The Speaker says she will just refuse to accept this acquittal. Speaker of the House says she refuses to accept this acquittal. Whatever that means. Perhaps she will tear up the verdict like she tore up the State of the Union address.
What a joke. Even
so I would ask my distinguished colleagues across the aisle, is this really?
Another super chat coming in from Ron Hubbard. You sell your Tesla yesterday at 9:50. Now it's 7:30. I'm just holding, my friend. I'm too busy following what's going on in the world to be trading stocks.
Attack institutions until they get their way. Even my colleagues who may not agree with this president must see the insanity of this logic. It's like saying you're so worried about a bull in a china shop that you want to bulldoze the china shop to chase it out. And here's the most troubling part. The most troubling part.
Tell us, Mitch.
There is no sign this attack on our institutions will end here. In recent months, Democratic presidential candidates and Senate leaders have toyed with killing a filibuster so the Senate could approve radical changes with less deliberation and less persuasion.
Unfortunately, this is live, so I can't put it at 1.5x speed.
Or threatening political retribution if the justices did not decide a case the way they wanted. We've seen proposals to turn the FEC, the regulator of elections and political speech, into a partisan body for the first time ever. All these things, Mr. President.
I did not. Jimmy Bignuts says, David, did you hear Joe Biden's Freudian slip after Iowa? I feel good about getting more than our fair share of delegates. I didn't see it. Tristan Clemens says, these people will do anything to stop Sanders. Civil war. We will talk about that. Not the topic of today, though. Trump's acquittal, the topic of today. Ryan Nowicki says, do you think establishment Democrats and Republicans would try to bring impeachment to Bernie at some point if he wins the presidential race? If so, what charge is most likely? Now, I mean, Ryan, that would be completely irresponsible speculation at this point.
Recklessness. The Senate was created to stop. The response to losing one election cannot be to attack the office of the presidency.
Which, of course, isn't happening. Let me say thank you to Tatiana Rodriguez, who is new member number 166 using the Impeach 50 coupon code, and also Ari Knyazev, who is number 167. This is the last day of impeachment. This is the last day of the coupon code Impeach 50. All right. We are close to our goal of 200 members using that code. Consider using it today at joinpacman.com. The last opportunity, as we are potentially just minutes from the acquittal of President Donald Trump.
Other way, as Madison and Hamilton intended, the institutions must break the fever rather than the other way around.
How many S's are there in institutions?
The framers built the Senate to keep temporary rage from doing permanent damage to our republic. The framers built the Senate to keep temporary rage from doing permanent damage to our republic. That, Mr. President, is what we will do when we end this precedent-breaking impeachment. I hope we will look back on this vote and say, this was the day the fever began to break.
We will not, no.
I hope we will not say this was just the beginning. I ask unanimous consent the Senate stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Without objection, the Senate stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
What on earth just happened? It froze at a very strange moment. Okay, so now they are in recess. Let's see if we are told. I'm just finding out what's going on. Let's see if we are told when it is that.
And with words from the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, the Senate impeachment trial of President Donald Trump coming to a close, votes are next on the two articles of impeachment on abuse of power and obstruction of Congress after some 78 members of the Senate spoke on the floor. 41 Democrats, 37 Republicans by our count, and they should be gaveling back in momentarily. The Chief Justice John Roberts arrived at the Capitol about 15 or 20 minutes ago.
Expecting a vote in Donald Trump's Senate impeachment trial any minute. Let me say thank you to David Kahn, who has just signed up at joinpacman.com and is new member number 168. We have been streaming the impeachment proceedings for weeks at this point. It is finally coming to a close today, and one that will simply not be satisfactory to anyone who believes that trials should have evidence and trials should have witnesses and trials should be adjudicated by jurors who come in with an open mind, willing to be convinced by evidence, willing to listen to what it is that is going to be presented rather than knowing in advance that they will be voting to acquit. I encourage you to help us reach this very ambitious goal of 200 new members using our Impeach 50 coupon code. We're at 168, and we've been carrying over the goal from day one. And I look forward to welcoming some additional folks. Welcome if you're watching on YouTube, Twitch, or Facebook. We are live on all of those platforms, and we are waiting for what is potentially just minutes away, an impeachment vote which will, by every indication, lead to the acquittal of President Donald Trump in what is only the third impeachment trial in American history. Andrew Johnson in the 1800s, acquitted. Bill Clinton in the 1900s, acquitted. And now Donald Trump in the year 2020, almost guaranteed to be acquitted. Mitt Romney, a Republican who did say he would be voting to convict Donald Trump on one article, but would be voting to acquit on the other article. We are witnessing history here, truly. Let me see what is on people's minds via Super Chat. Zachary Monroe says, we all need a joke during these frustrating times. What is Donald Trump's favorite type of clothing? Answer, Russian ties. All right. Jason Ealing says, impeachment was hopeless. The Republican Party has blind loyalty. Andy O'Neill says, nobody vote for Andrew Yin, who wants to take $1,000 from you each month. Andy, you seem confused about many things, more things than I am able to straighten you out about today. That is for damn sure, my friend. But I appreciate the $5 super chat. Also, thanks over on Twitch for the 100 bits from ODP, who said, what did ODP say? ODP said, this whole thing is so dumb. Democrats has many of these same positions during the Clinton impeachment. Why didn't they just focus on actually doing shit for the next 9 months and then vote the orange fuck out? Nobody clip that, please. Ryan Henry Dean says via Super Chat, do you believe Mitt is being sincere or revenging? Who on earth knows? Looks like they are gaveling back in here.
If there's no objection, the journal of proceedings of the trial are approved to date. The Deputy Sergeant at Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silence on pain of imprisonment while the Senate of the United States is sitting for the trial of the articles of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States. As a reminder to everyone in the chamber, as well as those in the galleries, demonstrations of approval or disapproval are prohibited.
Strictly so.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, the Senate is now ready to vote on the articles of impeachment, and after that is done, we will adjourn the court of impeachment.
Wow. It's
The
happening.
clerk will now read the first article of impeachment.
Oh, no.
Article 1, Abuse of Power. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives, quote, shall have the sole power of impeachment, unquote, and that the President, quote, shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery,
As
or
they continue to read, let me say thank you to Ian Breslin. Ian Breslin is new member 169 using the Impeach 50 coupon code 169. Coupon code Impeach 50 does save you 50% at joinpacman.com. Andy O'Neill says, it was a yin and yang joke. I'll see myself out. All right. Thank you very much. Trump Beatles says Andy's Andrew Yin thing was a joke. Yin yang. I understand. Thank you very much. We are in the middle of reading Article 1, and soon there will be a vote.
Ukraine in the 2020 United States presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his re-election, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit.
Let me say thank you to Tactical Wookie for subscribing with Twitch Prime, as well as Pogue Mahone 66. You two are subscribers 875 and 876 on Twitch.
President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. 1. President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into A, political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. 2,
That's a
with
mouthful.
the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within the outside of the United States government, conditioned 2 official acts on the public announcements that he had requested. A, the release of $391 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the president of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. 3, faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine and has persisted in openly and corruptly...
Let me say thank you to Alexandra Galadriel, who is new member number 170 at joinpacman.com. You know, we've heard these articles of impeachment many times. I am going to prioritize hearing from people. These are available online, and a couple people seem mad that I'm talking over stuff, but we've heard these multiple times. They're online. It's very hard to even really understand when these things are being read in this endless monotone. So I want to hear from you. Dan Stupka says Twitch donos don't show in Super Chat. Dumb. Yeah, Super Chat is a YouTube feature. Let me say thank you to David Dittmer. David Dittmer is new member number 171. We are only 29 members from the incredibly ambitious goal of 200. I also want to say there was a message over on Twitch that I missed. No, there is not. All right. We will go back to the droning monotone.
Under the United States.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place and vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment.
I'll keep track here.
Article 1, Section 3,
Not sure if
Clause
they'll do
6
it on
of the
screen.
Constitution regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment provides that no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present.
That means 67.
The question is on the first article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required. The
Here we
clerk
go.
will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Not guilty. Mr. Alexander, not guilty. Ms. Baldwin.
Oh, they have it on screen.
Ms. Baldwin, guilty.
Folks,
Mr.
it's happening.
Mr. Barrasso, not guilty.
This is the acquittal of Donald John
Mr.
Trump.
Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, not guilty.
As soon as
Booker.
34 say not guilty,
Mr.
it is
Booker.
mathematically over.
Guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, not guilty.
This
Ms.
is
Collins.
it, folks. This is the vote. Article
Ms.
1.
Collins, not guilty. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz.
Remember, 34 noes
Mr.
and
Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi,
Imagine
not guilty.
being Trump's
Ms.
lawyers
Ernst,
and feeling like you got him acquitted
Ms.
when it was like a
Ernst,
foregone conclusion from the
not
get-go.
guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher.
Was touch and go with Feinstein for a bit.
Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, not
Lindsay.
guilty.
Sit down,
Mr.
Lindsay.
Grassley. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Ms. Harris. Ms. Harris,
That's Kamala.
guilty.
Guilty.
Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Ms. Hirono.
If you're just joining us, this is Article
Ms.
1.
Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven.
11 more votes
Mr.
will acquit Trump.
Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, guilty. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King. Mr. King, guilty. Ms.
Halfway there,
Klobuchar.
that's 50 votes.
Ms. Klobuchar, guilty.
Guilty,
Mr.
says
Langford.
Amy.
Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee,
Four more not guilty votes will
Mrs.
acquit the
Loeffler.
president on Article 1,
Mrs.
abuse of
Loeffler,
power.
not guilty. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey.
Ed Markey,
Guilty.
Good guy.
Mr. McConnell.
not guilty.
Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Ms. McSally. Ms. McSally.
One more vote will do it, ladies and
Not
gentlemen, and the
guilty.
president will be acquitted on Article 1.
Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran.
And there it is, ladies and gentlemen. The
not
President of the
guilty.
United States,
Ms.
Donald
Murkowski.
Trump, has been acquitted on Article 1, abuse of power.
Ms. Murkowski, not guilty. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, guilty.
Lisa Murkowski,
Mrs.
ultimately,
Murray.
of course, voting not
Mrs.
guilty as
Murray,
predicted.
Guilty. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Perdue, not guilty. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed.
If you're just joining
Mr.
us, Donald
Reed,
Trump, just
guilty.
seconds ago, acquitted on
Mr.
Article 1
Risch.
abuse of power.
Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, not guilty. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, guilty.
Romney
Ms.
voting
Rosen.
guilty. An interesting note.
Ms.
That will be an
Rosen,
asterisk at the end of
guilty.
this. Mitt
Mr.
Romney,
Rounds.
Republican, voting guilty,
Mr. Rounds,
and no doubt will be
not
the target of
guilty.
Donald
Mr.
Trump's
Rubio.
ire for a while.
Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass.
Bernie Sanders voting guilty.
Mr. Sass, not guilty. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida.
That's Rick Scott as opposed to
not
Tim
guilty.
Scott from South
Mr.
Carolina.
Scott of South Carolina.
There he is.
Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, guilty.
Just 13 votes to go.
Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, not guilty.
Expecting
Mr. Udall.
52 to 48.
Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, not guilty.
And there it is. President Donald Trump acquitted on Article 1 abuse of power. Mitt Romney, the only Republican senator voting guilty. The clerk will now report the results momentarily. Typically, they ask if anybody wants to change their vote. Expecting 53 to 47 on Article 2. Mitt Romney will likely vote not guilty on Article 2. If you're just joining us, this is the acquittal of President Donald Trump in a sham trial with no witnesses. Not really an accomplishment for anybody. Donald Trump's lawyers having a very easy task, simply having to not fall down, basically. A foregone conclusion from the start. The only real surprise, Mitt Romney, the only Republican to vote guilty on Article 1. Let me say thanks to Shane Bushta, subscriber number
In this
172.
article of impeachment, 48 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 52 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment. The clerk will read the second article of impeachment.
So now they will read Article 2. Again, we've heard these articles many times. You can find them online, so I will continue to answer Super Chats while they read. I do want to thank Josie Breton, who is new member number 173. Want to make sure I don't forget to thank anybody. Julie Fong is number 174. and Darlene Sinclair is number 175. We are just 25 new members from a very, very steep goal of 200. The coupon code IMPEACH50 does save you 50% on my website. Timmy Lunsford asked via Super Chat, why am I watching this? I don't know. Bradford Betts has signed up on YouTube. Kellen sends a Super Chat. We will listen to a bit of Article 2.
Violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas.
Daniel Krieger says we all knew this would happen, but I'm still sad. We did know it would happen, and yet it is still. I mean, it's even if you know the outcome, when you see the sham nature of this conclude with a final point of, Romney voted guilty on Article 1 and likely will vote not guilty on Article 2. How can you not feel as though justice clearly was not done? We are waiting now on Article 2. They will vote momentarily.
Committee's undertaking the investigation serves subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices.
Thanks to
and
Jacob
current and
Bosnack for
former
the membership.
officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Kristen Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of the constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
And now they will vote on
Question is
Article
on
2.
the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent Donald John Trump guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Already
Mr.
acquitted
Alexander.
on Article 1.
Not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Mr. Barrasso.
Only difference we're
Not
expecting
guilty.
here is Romney to vote not
Mr.
guilty.
Bennett. Guilty.
Expecting 53
Mrs.
to
Blackburn.
47.
Not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Not guilty. Ms. Collins. Not guilty.
They go alphabetically
Mr. Coons.
for people wondering.
Guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Not guilty. Mr. Cruz.
Obviously.
Not guilty. Mr. Daines. Not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Guilty. Mr. Durbin. Guilty. Mr. Enzi. Not guilty. Ms. Ernst. Not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Not guilty. Mr. Gardner. Not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand.
If
Guilty.
you're just joining us, this is
Mr.
the vote
Graham.
on Article 2. Trump already acquitted on
Not
Article
guilty.
1.
Mr. Grassley. Not guilty. Ms. Harris. Guilty. Ms. Hassan.
On Article 1, Romney, the only
Guilty.
Republican to vote guilty.
Mr. Hawley.
Expecting not guilty on Article 2.
Not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Guilty. Ms. Hirono. Guilty. Mr. Hoven. Not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Not guilty. Mr. Jones. Guilty. Mr. Kane. Guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Not guilty. Mr. King. Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar. Guilty. Mr. Langford. Not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Guilty. Mr. Lee. Not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler.
Minutes from the acquittal on Article
Not
2 of Donald
guilty.
Trump.
Mr. Manchin. Guilty. Mr. Markey. Guilty. Mr. McConnell. Not guilty. Ms. McSally. Not guilty. Mr. Menendez. Guilty. Mr. Merkley. Guilty. Mr. Moran. Not guilty. Ms. Murkowski. Not guilty.
No surprise.
Mr.
there.
Murphy. Guilty. Mrs. Murray. Guilty. Mr. Paul. Not guilty. Mr. Perdue.
And Donald Trump is acquitted.
guilty.
Remember, you need
Mr.
67
Peters.
guilty, which means once you get to 34 not
Guilty.
guilty,
Mr.
it is
Portman.
over. And that is it. The President of the United
Not
States has
guilty.
been acquitted on
Mr.
both
Reed.
articles, Article 1 and 2.
Guilty. Mr. Risch.
Only question is up next, Romney. How does he vote?
Not guilty. Mr. Roberts.
Oh, no, one more.
Not guilty. Mr. Romney. Not guilty.
And there
Ms.
it is,
Rosen.
53 to 47 will be the final. Mitt Romney, the one
Guilty.
Republican to vote
Mr.
guilty on Article
Rounds.
1, voting not guilty on Article 2.
Not guilty. Mr. Rubio. Not guilty. Mr. Sanders? Guilty. Mr. Sass? Not guilty. Mr. Schatz? Guilty. Mr. Schumer? Guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida? Not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen? Guilty. Mr. Shelby? Not guilty. Ms. Sinema? Guilty. Ms. Smith? Guilty. Ms. Stabenow? Guilty. Mr. Sullivan? Not guilty. Mr. Tester? Guilty. Mr. Thune? Not guilty. Mr. Tillis? Not guilty. Mr. Toomey?
Just 9 to go.
Not guilty. Mr. Udall? Guilty. Mr. Van Hollen?
Elizabeth Warren upcoming.
Guilty. Mr. Warner? Guilty. Ms. Warren? Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse? Guilty. Mr. Wicker? Not guilty. Mr. Wyden? Guilty.
And there it is.
Mr. Young? Not
53
guilty.
to 47, exactly as predicted. They will now tally the votes. Donald Trump has been acquitted on all charges with no witnesses, with a very, very pleased Mitch McConnell. And we now go back to sort of pretending this never happened. Donald Trump will campaign on an exoneration. Donald Trump recently polling on the Gallup approval poll 49%, the highest that he has had all presidency. This may well reinvigorate the Trump base, and it is not a surprising result. Let me say thanks to Howard Hall, who's new member number 177. I appreciate that, Howard.
On this article of impeachment, 47 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 53 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment.
They will now move to end the trial formally and return the Senate to normal.
The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, President of the United States, upon 2 articles of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charges contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charges in said articles.
There it is, folks.
Mr. Chief Justice,
The majority leader is recognized.
I send an order to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Likely a formal measure to end the Senate as an impeachment court.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered.
Mr. Chief Justice,
The majority leader is recognized.
before this process fully concludes, I want to very quickly acknowledge a few of the people who helped the Senate fulfill our duty.
Here's a list of the
These
people who
past
helped
weeks.
us with this sham trial.
First and foremost, I know my colleagues join me in thanking Chief Justice Roberts for presiding over the Senate trial with a clear head, steady hand, and the forbearance that this rare occasion demands.
Give me a break, dude. Can you imagine? Show us who's not clapping.
We know full well that his presence as our presiding officer came in addition to, not instead of, his day job across the street. So the Senate thanks the Chief Justice and his staff who helped him perform this unique role. Like his predecessor, Chief Justice Rehnquist, the Senate will be awarding Chief Justice Roberts the Golden Gavel. to commemorate his time presiding over this body.
This is like
We
giving Rush
typically
Limbaugh the
award
Medal
this
of
to new
Freedom. I mean,
senators
this is
after
just
about
idiocy.
100 hours in the chair, but I think we can agree the Chief Justice has put in his due and then some.
Participation
Pages
trophies for
delivering
the
the
Chief Justice. I mean, this is the bottom of the barrel of American government. It's unbelievable.
Thank you very much.
Of course, there are countless Senate professionals whose efforts were essential. I'll have more thorough thanks to offer next week to all of those teams, from the Secretary of the Senate's office to the parliamentarians, to the Sergeant at Arms team, and beyond. But there are two more groups I'd like to single out now. First, the two different classes of Senate pages who participated in this trial. Their footwork and cool under pressure literally kept the floor running. Our current class came on board right in the middle of the third presidential impeachment trial in American history and quickly found themselves hand-delivering 180 question cards from senators' desks to the dais. No pressure, right, guys?
Everybody gets participation
So thank you
trophies,
all
and it's a
very much
sham
for your
trial.
good
It's
work.
amazing. Imagine cheering after this process. It's stunning.
And second, to fine men and women of the Capitol Police, we know that the safety of our democracy literally rests in their hands every single day. But the heightened measures surrounding the trial meant even more hours and even more work and even more vigilance. Thank you all very much for your service to this body and to the country.
The chair recognizes the Democratic leader.
I join the Republican leader in thanking the personnel who aided the Senate over the past several weeks. Capitol Police do an outstanding job day in, day out to protect the members of this chamber, their staffs, the press, and everyone who works in and visits this Capitol.
Feinstein getting ready
They
to
were
go to
asked to
dinner.
work extra shifts and in greater numbers to provide additional security over the past 3 weeks. Thank you to every one of them. I, too, would like to thank those wonderful pages.
And
I
off
so
she
much
goes.
enjoyed you with your
Feinstein's
serious
done.
faces walking down right here and giving the Chief Justice our questions. As the leader noted, the new class of pages started midway in this impeachment trial. When you take a new job, you're usually given a few days to take stock of things, get up to speed. This class was given no such leeway, but they stepped right in, didn't miss a beat, ferrying hundreds of questions from U.S. senators to the Chief Justice
The
on
performance
national
is ending,
television
guys.
is not how most
The
of us
curtain
spend
call
our
now.
first week at work, but they did it with aplomb. I'd also like to extend my personal thank you to David Houck, the Director of the Office of Accessibility Services, Tyler Pumphrey, the Supervisor, and Grace Ridgway, the wonderful Director of Capitol Facilities. Everyone Grace's team worked so hard to make sure we were ready for impeachment. Gary Richardson, known affectionately to us as Tiny, the chief chamber attendant. Jim Hoover and the cabinet shop, who built new cabinets to deprive us of the use of our electronics and flip phones during the trial.
Yeah, by the way, I see all the Trumpists showing up in my YouTube feed and in my Twitch stream. Feel free to do what it seems you all do when you start commenting on my videos, which is engage caps lock and disable spell check. We're ready for it.
Again and again. Grace, we appreciate all your hard work. Please convey our sincerest thanks to your staff. Thank you all, the whole staff, for your diligent work through many long days and late nights during this very trying time in our nation's history.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The chair also wishes to make a very brief statement.
Oh, great.
I would like to begin by thanking the Majority Leader and the Democratic Leader for their support as I attempted to carry out ill-defined responsibilities in an unfamiliar setting.
This is what I think about this
They
statement.
ensured that I had the wise counsel of the Senate itself through its secretary and her legislative staff. I am especially grateful to the parliamentarian and her deputy for their unfailing patience and keen insight. I am likewise grateful to the Sergeant at Arms and his staff for the assistance and many courtesies that they extended during my period of required residency. And thank you all for making my presence here as comfortable as possible. As I depart the chamber, I do so with an invitation to visit the court. By long tradition and in memory of the 135 years we sat in this building, we keep the front row of the gallery in our courtroom open for members of Congress who might want to drop by to see an argument or to escape one.
Dude, come on.
I also depart with sincere good wishes as we carry out our common commitment to the Constitution through the distinct roles assigned to us by that charter. You have been generous hosts, and I look forward to seeing you again under happier circumstances. The chair recognizes the majority leader.
I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the articles against Donald John Trump, adjourn, sine die.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned, sine die.
Sign and die, my friend, sign and die. The conclusion of the acquittal of Donald John Trump. Frederick Colbert, thank you. You are new member number 178. This is it, folks. This is the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning, or just part 7 of 752. This is going to be a notable year in American politics. We have extreme levels of drama already. In the first Democratic primary, the Iowa caucus, we have the president now totally exonerated, as all of the caps lock crew is. I think that's what we're going to call the Trumpists that raid my channel, the caps lock crew. I see a lot of drama in what is left of this year, up through and including the November 3rd election. Justice John Roberts is leaving the chamber. It looks like accompanied. Is that Looney Lindsay? That is Looney Lindsey Graham, right? And yes, Dianne Feinstein there, and Capitol Police, of course, keeping order. The Senate chamber slowly emptying as the President of the United States has been acquitted on both charges. The votes almost identical, 52-48 in favor of acquittal. On Article 1, Mitt Romney, Willard Mittens Romney, the only Republican to vote guilty. Willard not voting guilty on Article 2, where it was 53-47. You see the impeachment managers exiting, and that is going to do it, ladies and gentlemen. That is it. We are going to get back. I've got a million things to do. I did want to get in here for the actual final vote. Thanks to everybody who has joined me throughout the impeachment hearings. We did get 178 people signed up with the coupon code IMPEACH50. The goal of 200 was ambitious. 178 is nothing to sneeze at. We will be back with a brand new show tomorrow, including coverage, reaction, blah, blah, blah.